when my manager Tom Richardson looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're just a secretary, Emma. Stay in your lane." He had no idea that within 72 hours, I'd be the one holding the power to shut down his entire operation. What he didn't know was that I'd already discovered the expired federal compliance license that kept our company legally operational, and I was the only one who could renew it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I had been staring at that renewal notice for 3 weeks. Federal Operating License 847GX2901 expires March 15th. The certified letter sat buried under a stack of vendor invoices on my desk at Meridian Industrial Solutions, our mid-sized manufacturing firm in Cleveland. Everyone assumed the legal department handled these things. Everyone was wrong. The letter was addressed to License Administrator, a role that technically belonged to our former compliance officer Janet Morrison, who'd been laid off 8 months ago. Her responsibilities had been quietly redistributed among existing staff. But somehow this critical piece fell through the cracks. The renewal required a 45-day processing period, and we were now down to 18 days. I'd tried to bring it up twice before. The first time, Tom's assistant Lisa brushed me off with a patronizing smile. "Emma, sweetie, that's way above your pay grade. I'm sure someone's handling it." The second time, I caught Tom himself rushing between meetings, and he barely glanced at the document I held out. "Forward it to legal," he'd said without breaking stride. "That's what we pay them for." But I knew something Tom didn't. Our legal department was swamped with a massive product liability case, and their junior associate handling compliance matters had started just 6 weeks ago. Fresh out of law school, overwhelmed and drowning in more complex issues, he'd never even seen this type of federal license before. The morning of March 12th, everything changed. I arrived early, as always, coffee in hand, and my usual quiet efficiency intact. Tom was already in his glass office, gesticulating wildly during a conference call with potential investors. Through the thin walls, I could hear fragments. Expansion plans, Q2 projections, regulatory compliance fully secured. That last phrase made my stomach tighten. I pulled out the renewal notice again, now showing just 3 days until expiration. The federal website was clear. Operations must cease immediately upon license expiration until renewal is approved and processed. No exceptions. No grace period. I knocked on Tom's doorframe. He held up a finger without looking at me, continuing his pitch about how Meridian was positioned for unprecedented growth with zero regulatory obstacles. I waited. The irony wasn't lost on me. When he finally hung up, his face was flushed with excitement. "Emma, that was Davidson Capital. They're considering a $12 million investment. Can you believe it? This company is about to explode." "Tom, we need to discuss the federal operating license. It expires in 3 days, and..." He cut me off with that condescending laugh I'd grown to despise. "Emma, you're just a secretary. Stay in your lane. I don't have time for administrative panic attacks. Whatever paperwork emergency you think we have, I'm sure it's handled." The dismissal stung, but it was his next words that changed everything. "Look, I know you mean well, but leave the big picture stuff to people who actually understand how businesses work. Your job is to answer phones and file papers. Let the professionals handle professional matters." Something crystallized in that moment. Not anger, clarity. Tom Richardson had just made the biggest mistake of his career, and he didn't even know it. I returned to my desk with renewed purpose. Instead of feeling defeated, I felt strategic. I pulled up the federal licensing database and created my own account. The system required an official company representative to manage renewals, someone with documented authority to act on behalf of Meridian Industrial Solutions. Here's what Tom didn't know. When Janet Morrison left, HR never formally transferred her administrative privileges. Her digital signature authority, her federal registration status, her compliance certifications, all still active in the system. And as her former assistant, I had access to all her passwords and security credentials. Technically, I could renew the license myself. But that would solve Tom's problem. And after 8 years of condescension, dismissal, and watching him take credit for solutions I'd provided, I realized I didn't want to solve his problem anymore. Instead, I wanted him to understand exactly how much his just a secretary really knew. I spent my lunch break researching the consequences of operating without a valid federal license. The penalties were severe: immediate shutdown orders, federal fines starting at $50,000 per day, potential criminal charges for willful noncompliance, and permanent prohibition from obtaining future licenses for company leadership. More importantly, I discovered that license renewals could only be processed by specifically authorized personnel. Since Janet was gone, and no one had officially transferred her authority, I was technically the only person in the company who could legally submit the renewal application. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The power dynamic had just shifted completely, and Tom had no idea. That afternoon, I watched him parade through the office, energized by his investor call. He announced an impromptu staff meeting for 4 p.m. to discuss, quote, Meridian's bright future and upcoming expansion opportunities. His confidence was infectious. Employees were buzzing with excitement about potential raises, new positions, maybe even profit-sharing bonuses. I sat in the back of the conference room, listening to Tom paint pictures of doubled production capacity, new facility acquisitions, and market domination. He spoke with such authority about regulatory approvals and compliance frameworks that I almost admired his conviction. Almost. As you all know, he proclaimed, Meridian operates at the highest level of regulatory compliance. We've got every license, every certification, every approval we need to scale this operation indefinitely. That's the foundation of our success. Scattered applause filled the room. Sarah from accounting was practically glowing. Mike from production was already mentally spending his anticipated bonus. Even Linda from HR, usually skeptical of Tom's grandiose promises, was nodding approvingly. I remained silent, but inside I was calculating. 68 hours until license expiration. 45 days minimum for renewal processing. If operations ceased for 45 days, Meridian would lose the Davidson Capital investment, default on 3 major contracts, and likely face bankruptcy. All because Tom Richardson thought secretaries didn't understand big-picture stuff. After the meeting, I lingered in the hallway and overheard Tom on another call with his attorney, presumably discussing final details for the Davidson Capital deal. No regulatory obstacles whatsoever, he was saying. We're bulletproof on compliance. I've got people handling every detail. I walked back to my desk and pulled up Janet Morrison's digital profile one more time. Her system access was still active. Her renewal authority was still valid. The federal database still recognized her as Meridian's official compliance administrator. But Janet Morrison was gone. And the only person who knew how to use her credentials was sitting at the secretary's desk, filing papers and answering phones like Tom expected. That evening, I drove home to my small apartment and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and my laptop. I reviewed every federal regulation, every compliance requirement, every procedural detail related to our operating license. I wasn't just researching anymore, I was preparing. The license would expire at midnight on March 15th. Renewal applications required a 45-day processing period with no exceptions for emergency submissions. Once expired, operations must cease immediately until renewal was approved. I had the power to renew it myself, using Janet's still active credentials. But I also had the power to let it expire. And if I chose the latter, Tom Richardson would finally understand that his, quote, just a secretary knew more about keeping his company operational than he ever would. The next morning, I arrived at work with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Tom was already in crisis mode, though he didn't know it yet. The Davidson Capital representatives were scheduled to tour our facility that afternoon, and Tom was buzzing around the office, making sure everything looked perfect. Emma, he called out as he rushed past my desk, make sure the conference room is spotless. Order some of those fancy pastries from that bakery downtown. This tour needs to be flawless. I nodded and made the arrangements, all while keeping one eye on the federal licensing website. The countdown continued. 43 hours until expiration. At 2 p.m., the Davidson Capital team arrived, 3 serious-looking executives in expensive suits, carrying tablets and asking detailed questions about our operational capacity, regulatory status, and growth projections. Tom was in his element, confidently fielding every question with the polish of a seasoned salesman. I served coffee and pastries, practically invisible as always, but I listened to every word. "And you're confident about regulatory compliance?" asked the lead executive, a stern woman with silver hair. "Absolutely," Tom replied without hesitation. "We exceed every federal requirement. Our compliance officer ensures we're always ahead of renewal deadlines and regulatory changes." The lie came so easily that I wondered if Tom actually believed it himself. We hadn't had a compliance officer for 8 months, and he just told potential investors that we had one. But his confidence was convincing. By the end of the tour, the Davidson team was impressed enough to schedule a final contract signing for the following week. $12 million, contingent on final due diligence and regulatory verification. As they left, I heard the lead executive mention to her assistant, "Have our legal team verify their federal operating license status before we finalize anything." Standard procedure. My heart rate quickened. The due diligence would reveal our expired license within days. Tom's entire house of cards was about to collapse, and he still had no idea. That night, I made my decision. I wasn't going to renew the license, and I wasn't going to warn Tom again. He'd had multiple opportunities to take me seriously, to listen when I tried to help, to treat me like a professional instead of dismissing me as just a secretary. Instead, I was going to let him learn the hard way exactly how much his business depended on the woman he'd spent 8 years underestimating. The final day arrived with unusual warmth for March in Cleveland. I came to work early, as always, and watched the sunrise paint the office windows golden. In 14 hours, our federal operating license would expire, and Tom Richardson's world would begin to crumble. He bounded into the office at 8:30, more energetic than I'd seen him in months. The Davidson Capital deal had him floating on pure adrenaline, and he was already making plans for our expansion. "Emma," he said, stopping by my desk with that familiar patronizing smile, "I need you to start researching office space in Columbus. We're going to need a second facility within 6 months." I looked up from my computer, where I'd been monitoring the license expiration countdown. "Of course, Tom. I'll get right on that." He didn't notice the slight edge in my voice, or the way I emphasized his name instead of using Mr. Richardson like he preferred. He was too busy living in his fantasy of unlimited growth and expansion. But in just a few hours, reality was going to hit him like a freight train. And for the first time in 8 years, I was going to be the one watching from a position of power, while he scrambled to understand what had gone wrong. The clock on my computer screen showed 11:47 p.m. as I sat in my apartment, laptop open to the federal licensing database. In 13 minutes, Meridian Industrial Solutions would officially become an unlicensed operation, legally prohibited from conducting business until renewal was approved and processed. Tom Richardson was about to learn that secretaries don't just file papers and answer phones. Sometimes, they hold the keys to everything. The first call came at 6:47 a.m. Tom's panicked voice crackled through my phone, waking me from the deepest sleep I'd had in months. "Emma, thank God you answered. We have a massive problem. I need you in the office immediately." I sat up slowly, feigning grogginess while my mind was already crystal clear. "What's wrong, Tom?" "The feds shut us down. There's a notice on our front door saying we're operating without a valid license. This has to be some kind of mistake. I need you to call whoever handles this stuff and get it sorted out before anyone else sees it." I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. "I'll be there in an hour." "An hour?" "Emma, this is an emergency. I need you here now." "I understand it's urgent, Tom. I'll be there as soon as I can." I hung up and made myself a proper breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast, fresh coffee. For the first time in 8 years, Tom Richardson was waiting for me instead of the other way around. When I arrived at Meridian, Tom was pacing in the parking lot like a caged animal. A bright orange notice was plastered across our main entrance. Federal compliance violation. Operations suspended pending license renewal. Several employees had gathered around it, reading in confused silence. Emma, finally! Tom rushed over, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his tie crooked. This is insane. We've never had compliance issues. I need you to find out who screwed this up and fix it immediately. I approached the notice and read it carefully, as if seeing it for the first time. This says our federal operating license expired at midnight. License number 847GX2901. That's impossible. Our legal department handles all that. I turned to face him, my expression neutral. Tom, our legal department is handling the Morrison lawsuit. And Janet Morrison was our compliance officer. She's been gone for 8 months. For the first time, I watched uncertainty flicker across his face. Well, someone must have taken over her responsibilities. These things don't just fall through the cracks. Actually, they do. I tried to bring this to your attention 3 weeks ago. You told me to stay in my lane because I'm just a secretary. The color drained from his face as the memory hit him. Around us, more employees were arriving for work, only to find themselves locked out of their own building. Sarah from accounting was on her phone, presumably calling her husband to explain why she'd be home early. Mike from production stood staring at the notice like it might change if he looked hard enough. Emma, you have to help me fix this. How long does a renewal take? I pulled out my phone and accessed the federal website I'd memorized over the past weeks. 45 days minimum processing time. No exceptions for emergency applications. 45 days? His voice cracked. We can't shut down for 45 days. The Davidson Capital signing is next week. We have contracts, payroll, obligations. I watched him spiral, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and pity. This was the same man who'd dismissed my concerns with such arrogance just days ago. Now he was begging for my help. There might be one option, I said carefully. The renewal has to be submitted by an authorized compliance administrator, someone with proper federal credentials and system access. Hope flashed in his eyes. Great. Get our legal team on this immediately. They can't do it. The system only recognizes previously authorized personnel. Janet Morrison was our last registered administrator. Tom ran his hands through his hair, completely destroying what was left of his professional appearance. Then we'll get new authorization, whatever it takes. That requires a separate application process, another 30 days minimum plus background checks and federal approval. And that's before we can even submit the license renewal. I watched the math dawn on him. 75 days minimum before we could legally operate again. His $12 million deal would evaporate. His expansion plans would crumble. His company would likely face bankruptcy. There has to be another way, he whispered. I pretended to think, checking my phone again. Actually, there is one possibility. Janet Morrison's system access is still active. Her administrator credentials haven't been revoked yet. Then use them. Submit the renewal right now. I can't do that, Tom. Using someone else's federal credentials without proper authorization is a federal crime. I could face serious legal consequences. But you know how to do it? The question hung in the air between us. Around us, confused employees were starting to disperse, some calling their families, others standing in small groups trying to make sense of the situation. Our security guard, an elderly man named Robert, who'd worked here longer than anyone, was shaking his head in disbelief. I helped Janet with the administrative aspects of compliance management, I said carefully. But I was never given official authority to act independently. Tom's desperation was becoming palpable. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Emma, I need you to think outside the box here. Is there any way, any legal way, you could help us get this license renewed? This was the moment I'd been waiting for. 8 years of condescension, dismissal, and being treated like office furniture had led to this single conversation. There might be a way, I said slowly. But it would require some significant changes around here. Anything. Name it. I pulled out a folder from my bag, documents I'd prepared the night before. First, I'd need official appointment as interim compliance administrator. Signed documentation giving me full authority to manage all regulatory matters. Done. What else? A formal apology to the entire staff for the compliance oversight. And acknowledgement that this situation could have been prevented if management had listened to administrative concerns. Tom's jaw tightened. His pride was battling his desperation, and I could see the internal struggle playing out across his face. And one more thing, I continued. I want Janet Morrison's old position. Official title, proper salary, decision-making authority over all compliance matters. Emma, that's a management-level position. You don't have the qualifications. I have 8 years of experience managing the details that keep this company running. I know our operations better than anyone except maybe Robert over there. And I'm apparently the only person who actually reads the federal notices that keep us legally operational. Tom looked around at the empty building, at the federal notice sealing our doors, at the employees trickling away with no idea when they'd be able to return to work. The Davidson Capital representatives would arrive next week to find a shuttered facility and an invalid compliance status. Fine, he said finally. Interim compliance administrator, formal apology, and we'll discuss the permanent position after we get through this crisis. The permanent position is non-negotiable, Tom. Right now, I'm the only thing standing between Meridian and complete collapse. I think that deserves proper recognition. He closed his eyes, probably calculating the cost of my demands against the cost of losing everything. When he opened them again, something had changed in his expression. For the first time in 8 years, he was looking at me like an equal. Okay, you'll get Janet's position, full authority, proper compensation. Just please tell me you can fix this. I opened my folder and handed him a pre-drafted employment contract I'd written the night before. Sign this, and I'll submit the renewal application within the hour. Tom didn't even read it. He signed with shaking hands, desperate to solve the crisis that his arrogance had created. While he called an emergency staff meeting to explain the situation, I sat in my car and accessed Janet Morrison's federal account one final time. The renewal application was complex, 37 pages of detailed operational information, compliance certifications, and regulatory attestations. But I'd been managing these details for years, even if no one had officially recognized it. Within 40 minutes, I'd submitted a complete renewal application for Meridian Industrial Solutions. The system confirmed receipt and provided an estimated processing time of 42 days. I walked back into the building just as Tom was finishing his explanation to the gathered staff. His voice was subdued, his usual confidence replaced by visible humility. This situation occurred because of management oversight, he was saying. We failed to properly manage our compliance obligations, and that failure is entirely on leadership, not on any of you. When he saw me enter, he paused. I'm also pleased to announce that Emma Winters has been promoted to Director of Compliance and Risk Management, effective immediately. She'll be taking over all regulatory matters to ensure this never happens again. The applause was genuine but confused. Most of my colleagues had never seen me as anything more than Tom's assistant, but Sarah from accounting caught my eye and smiled, apparently remembering the times I'd helped her navigate complex vendor compliance requirements. After the meeting, Tom approached me privately. How long before we know about the renewal? The application is submitted and confirmed. We should receive preliminary approval within 10 business days, which will allow us to resume limited operations. Full certification will take the complete 42 days. In the Davidson Capital deal, you'll need to disclose the compliance issue and the temporary operational suspension. They may still proceed, but probably with modified terms and enhanced due diligence requirements. Tom nodded, accepting the reality that his perfect deal had become significantly more complicated. Emma, I owe you an apology. You tried to warn me, and I dismissed you. That was unprofessional and stupid. I studied his face, looking for signs of genuine understanding versus mere crisis management. Tom, this isn't really about the apology. It's about fundamental respect for the people who actually keep this place running. You're right. And going forward, things will be different. 10 days later, the preliminary approval arrived, allowing Meridian to resume basic operations while the full renewal processed. Tom had to renegotiate the Davidson Capital deal, ultimately accepting $8 million instead of $12 million, and submitting to enhanced oversight requirements. But the company survived. More importantly, the culture began to shift. In my new role, I implemented comprehensive compliance monitoring systems, created cross-training protocols to prevent single points of failure, and established regular communication channels between administrative staff and management. 6 months later, I was reviewing quarterly compliance reports in my new office, Janet Morrison's old space, with a window view and my name on the door. Tom knocked and entered, carrying a folder I recognized. "The Davidson Capital Partnership is officially finalized," he said, setting the signed contracts on my desk. $8 million in growth funding with an option for additional investment based on performance metrics. Congratulations. That's excellent news for everyone here. He sat down across from my desk, a gesture that still felt surreal after years of standing conversations by his office door. "Emma, I've been thinking about what happened 6 months ago. About how close we came to losing everything. It was a learning experience for all of us. No, it was more than that. It was a wake-up call about leadership, about respect, about recognizing value regardless of job titles." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I spent 8 years treating you like support staff when you were actually essential infrastructure." I appreciated his honesty, but I'd moved beyond needing his validation. The important thing is that we've built better systems now. This won't happen again. Because of you. Because you saw the problem, tried to solve it through proper channels, and then found another way when those channels failed. As he left my office, I reflected on the journey from secretary to director. It hadn't been about revenge, ultimately. It had been about demonstrating value, demanding recognition, and refusing to accept limitations others tried to impose. That evening, I called my mentor, Dr. Patricia Hughes, the business professor who'd encouraged me to pursue my MBA while working full-time at Meridian. She'd been following my career transformation with professional interest. "Emma, I'm proud of how you handled the situation," she said. "You turned a crisis into an opportunity for systematic change." It felt like the right approach. Destructive revenge would have hurt everyone, including the employees who depend on this company. That's mature leadership thinking. Speaking of which, I have some news. The Regional Compliance Consortium is looking for a keynote speaker for their annual conference. They want someone to discuss proactive risk management and organizational culture change. The invitation was both flattering and intimidating. A year ago, I'd been answering phones and filing papers. Now I was being asked to share expertise with compliance professionals across 3 states. "I think you should do it," Dr. Hughes continued. "Your story demonstrates that effective compliance isn't just about following rules. It's about creating cultures where critical information can flow upward, regardless of hierarchy." 3 months later, I stood at a podium facing an audience of 200 compliance officers, risk managers, and corporate executives. My presentation was titled, "The View from the Front Lines: How Administrative Staff Drive Organizational Resilience." Compliance isn't a department, I told the audience. It's a mindset that has to permeate every level of an organization. The people who process your mail, answer your phones, and file your documents often see problems before executives do. The question is, are you listening? I shared Meridian's story without naming names or assigning blame, focusing instead on the systemic changes that had transformed our culture. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several attendees approaching me afterward to discuss implementing similar communication protocols at their companies. A year after the license crisis, Meridian had not only survived, but thrived. Our compliance program became a model for other mid-sized manufacturers, and we'd successfully expanded into 2 new markets with Davidson Capital's support. But the real transformation wasn't in our business metrics. It was in our relationships. Tom had evolved from a dismissive manager into a collaborative leader who regularly sought input from staff at every level. Sarah from accounting had been promoted to financial analyst. Mike from production was leading our new quality assurance initiative. And I had discovered that my years of quiet observation and detail management had actually been preparing me for strategic leadership in ways I'd never recognized. On the anniversary of our federal license crisis, Tom organized a company-wide celebration. During his remarks, he acknowledged the near disaster that had almost destroyed Meridian and credited the cultural changes that followed with our subsequent success. "A year ago, we learned that titles don't determine value," he told the assembled staff. "The person who saved this company wasn't in the executive suite. She was at the front desk, doing the work that actually keeps organizations operational." The applause was warm and genuine, but I found myself thinking less about recognition and more about possibility. In 12 months, I'd gone from invisible support staff to recognized leader. The experience had taught me that expertise and authority aren't always aligned, but persistent competence eventually creates its own opportunities. As the celebration continued around me, I stepped outside for some fresh air and perspective. The same building that had once felt like a cage now felt like a launching pad. I'd proven I could transform crisis into opportunity, but more importantly, I'd learned to value my own capabilities regardless of external validation. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Hughes. "Saw the industry article about Meridian's compliance transformation. Congratulations on being featured as a case study leader. Ready for the next challenge?" I smiled, looking back at the building where my career had been reborn through crisis and determination. Ready didn't begin to cover how I felt about the future. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.